Hello, and welcome back to Truly Tragic Transits with me, Rebecca Lovett. In today's episode, we are exploring the energetic story behind the passing of Avicii, a life defined by sensitivity and creativity and an extraordinary inner pressure that was really visible to the outside world. And this episode touches on suicide, long-term physical illness and substance abuse. It's shared with care and respect, and in the intention and understanding that this is not about judgment and not about blame. This is a story really about survival and about the body and what happens when pressure is carried internally for far too long. As always on Truly Tragic Transits, I'm looking really at three things. The first thing I like to examine is the potential energy. So the blueprint that someone is born with. What does that tell us about their story? The second thing is looking at shadow triggers, so the transits and environments that activate vulnerability within a person. And then the third thing that we look at is choice and consequence, not as morality, but as a nervous system response under stress. Because as you'll have heard me mention in the last episode, and I think I mentioned it in the episode before as well, a lot of the time when we are going through things, we are reacting rather than acting. And what we see through a lot of these truly tragic transits is people making decisions from a place of reaction rather than action. And there is a difference. Reaction comes from a place of dysregulation. Action comes from a place of knowing deeply and regulation. We are making a cool and calm and measured and aligned decision. But unfortunately, that is not what we see in a lot of the truly tragic transits, because we are not really taught, and this is getting better, but we are not really taught about this difference between reaction and action, and society also doesn't meet that particularly kindly either. So Avicii's story can really show us what happens when just carrying on, just enduring becomes expectation. You know, what happens when someone is put under so much pressure, whether that's from themselves or from other people, to keep going, keep producing and keep making when their body is asking for rest. Now, the first place that I want to start is that Avicii was a Scorpio rising, meaning that his chart was ruled by Pluto, with Mars as a co-ruler. Now, the reason why Pluto and Mars both rule his chart is because originally Scorpio was ruled by Mars until we discovered Pluto, and then Pluto became the modern ruler. So it's often, you'll see it interpreted in Vedic or sidereal astrology as Mars, which is a personal planet, but ultimately it's Pluto in a modern context that rules Scorpio. And Scorpio rising individuals do not skim the surface of life. They endure, they internalize, they store stress in the body, but really importantly, they are here for the experience of depth. Scorpio rising individuals are not here for surface level life. They are here to get stuck in and get dirty and experience and embody life, rather than escape it. And in Avicii's case, this intensity was really magnified by his natal chart. So in his natal chart, Pluto sat in Scorpio, as it does for many people of his generation, myself included. Because Pluto is a generational planet, it doesn't move signs for 25 odd years. So anyone within a radius of Avicii is going to have Pluto in Scorpio. But it was in the 12th house, exactly on his ascendant. And this is what is unusual, because this is one of the most private yet heavily placed placements that a person can carry. The 12th house really looks after or governs isolation, the unconscious mind, unconscious materials, sacrifice, hidden suffering. With Pluto here, struggle often happens out of sight. Now, this is important when you think about this story, because I know it came as a shock to a lot of people, this death, this suicide. But if you've got Pluto in the 12th house, this can really make secrets out of suffering. And this is someone who has a potential to survive by pushing through. So they, instead of confronting or finding help, seeking help, they've got power. They've got power there. Pluto is power. So there's almost a self-expectation to push through. And someone whose battles maybe aren't easily visible, and this is where it comes into play that we can't always notice what struggles people are going through, and that's why it's important to not carry judgment, carry shame. And it's also someone who has the potential to carry pressure internally rather than releasing it outwardly. Any planets that we see sat in the 12th house can be deeply internalized, deeply hidden, deeply secretive, rather than outwardly expressing. And Pluto on the ascendant specifically gives enormous resilience, but it also means that the body becomes the container for everything that goes unsaid, unspoken, hidden. And that Pluto, that one, I'm really focusing in on Pluto for this episode, because that Pluto also forms a trine to Chiron in Pisces in the 8th house. Now, Chiron in the 8th house really speaks to deep wounds around survival and power and loss and kind of existential meaning. Can never get that word right. In Pisces, this wound is porous. This Chiron wound is porous. It's empathetic. It merges or is submerged, and it can be easily overwhelmed. And that trine within his chart really shows that Avicii could have functioned through his pain, but it also meant that there were a few barriers between suffering and identity. And the suffering had the potential to become an identity component. So this Chiron placement is opposed by Saturn in Capricorn in the 3rd house. If you look at Avicii's chart as I'm speaking this through, there's almost a story that plays out. Because Chiron is opposed by Saturn in Capricorn in the 3rd house, and this is where work and money, an obligation and responsibility begin to enter the story of Avicii. Saturn in Capricorn really carries quite a heavy load, quite a heavy responsibility. Capricorn is has a potential to be a martyr quite a lot, because it's about kind of digging in, moving through responsibility, showing up, determination, working hard, trying harder. It's a very resilient sign. And Saturn in Capricorn really emphasizes the need for slow, steady, dependable progress, especially when it comes to his mind, because in the 3rd house, really that responsibility lives in communication, in day-to-day mental load, in learning, in schedules, in decisions, in the way that our mind makes kind of thoughts. And what is starting to come out of this through Pluto trine Chiron opposed by Saturn, is that this is someone who really would have felt mentally responsible for outcomes. When we talk about pressure, this is a pressure cooker ready to go off. Someone whose value became tied to productivity, who perhaps struggle to rest without guilt. You know, we see that. I don't know if anyone's watched the documentary. I think it's on Netflix. You see the story of how hard he worked. He was an absolute workhorse and such a perfectionist. That is Capricorn, third house, Saturn, Capricorn, third house, to a T. The earth signs have a real expectation of themselves. You know, they live a little bit too much in reality. And that's coming from a Virgo rising. They can be too practical, they can be too realistic, they can be too hard on themselves, they can be too real, they can be too earthy. So this really was someone who would have felt such mental pressure and responsibility for that productivity, you know, doing well, making a name for themselves. Success wasn't about achievement, or wasn't just about achievement anyway. It was a survival mechanism at the same time. If I did well, I survived, the tribe survived, the family did well. But remember, this is opposes Chiron, and his Chiron also starts to show that this is going to be a vulnerability. What happens when we have planets opposed often is that we try and choose one or the other. And what we are often asked to do is find balance between the two. And over time, this pressure wouldn't have stayed purely psychological. It would have moved into the body. And, you know, I'm just reciting some of these things that I jotted down through the documentary and through things that I've read. But he had an alcohol problem, excessive alcohol use, pancreatitis, I can't say that word, pancreatitis. There we go, pancreatitis. I can't see, you know what, there's some words that you just can't get out, and that is one of them. Kidney and liver issues. These organs are the first to suffer under chronic stress and fear. You know, when we think about alcohol, for example, as a way of numbing what we are trying to balance, what we are trying to feel, we add on top of that the fact that this is a Scorpio rising. This is someone who has the capacity to feel exceptionally deeply, much deeply than a lot of people have the capacity to feel. And we have a bit of a catalyst, because these organs, as I say, are the first to suffer really under chronic stress, and a Scorpio rising body doesn't just experience stress, it stores it. Scorpio risings are water. If we think about what water is, it is emotion, it is designed to flow, it is designed to move, it is designed to be expressed. But if we are keeping a lid on that, numbing it and suppressing it, that is a catalyst that is ready to go off. Avicii sadly passed away on the 20th of April 2018, which was just 2 days before Pluto stationed retrograde. I've spoken about this pattern quite a lot over the last few episodes. It's something that I teach within my energy-informed treatment program, treatment planning, and human design for therapists as well, because this is a pattern that we see quite often with mental ill health, that as their ruling planet either is about to station or stations retrograde, or is just about to come out of retrograde, so that kind of few days before, few days at the start and few days at the end, pressure is intense. It's a pattern that we see over and over and over again. I don't know why people don't take it more seriously. It's quite frustrating, because these could be support systems that are put in place for people to recognise that this is a pattern that is about to potentially set up again. So he died. His chart is ruled by Pluto. That means Pluto is setting off his journey of life. and he died 2 days before Pluto stationed retrograde. This is a pressure point. These are energy compressors. There is no forward movement or motion, and everything just turns inwards when we hit a retrograde. What I should say as well is that retrogrades, the planet is not actually moving backwards, but from our perspective here on Earth, it feels like that planet is moving backwards. Now, if we take that analogy and apply it to mental health, what you will often see when these planets station retrograde is a fall back into an old pattern, like they are going backwards. It is an illusion, they are not. But when they are in that situation, they don't always have the awareness of the bigger picture at large, and the fact that we are interconnected with nature. We are nature. We're not separate from it. And as I say, I just wish people took this more seriously. So for someone whose chart was ruled by Pluto and who has Pluto sitting on the ascendant, this would have felt, in fact, every Pluto retrograde would have felt like a rebirth opportunity of their identity. That could have been deeply empowering if it was supported, but it was largely left misunderstood. When the body is already depleted and inflamed and exhausted, the question that comes to someone with this pattern would be, what cannot continue? Pluto asks one question: what cannot continue? And when the body is already depleted, already tired, already inflamed, already overworked, the question that Pluto asks, what cannot continue, can feel unbearable. Now, the final layer, the final part of this puzzle piece is very often the astrocartography. It is the place. Where were they when this pattern was about to happen? Avicii died in Muscat, Oman. It's the capital city of Oman. An astrocartography, when we look at the astrocartography chart, this is where Lilith, Venus, and Chiron all converge on his natal map. Now that is a potent, dark, vulnerable place. Perfectly great for someone to visit if they are going in with the intention of digging a little bit deeper, perhaps doing some healing work or shadow work, or wanting to really tap into the darkness that sits within them. But if this is someone who struggled with mental health or with addiction problems, this is a place where those things would have risen to the surface and been triggered within someone. Again, we've seen the astrocartography play a massive part in people's untimely passing, over and over and over again. Liam Payne, Matthew Perry, Whitney Houston. There's been so many episodes where I've done where the astrocartography, Steve Irwin last week, so many where the astrocartography pointed to it never points to potential problems. It points to the neutrality of the energy that is contained there, and we have to decide whether we are in a place to step into that energy or not. It's always our choice. We're not ruled by the stars and planets. We work with them. Venus speaks to worth, self-worth, love, value, self-value. Chiron speaks to wounds that have never fully healed or will never fully heal. And Lilith is the real crux in this. Lilith speaks to exile, to shame. Oh, Lilith and shame. Shame, mental health, trauma. Lilith, look what's going on with Lilith. and the parts of us that feel rejected or unlovable or unloved. So when these three energies meet geographically in Muscat, Oman, and I can't stress to you how close he would have been to these lines. You don't see these lines coming together very often. He chose to go to a space that had probably one of the darkest energies that I've seen together on a map when we couple that with the story that someone is going through. There's the stories of not being enough, not being valued, or only being valued for their productivity or their output, feeling cut off from safety or love or softness, loving deeply but without being protected. And this wasn't a new wound. This wouldn't have been something that would have been a surprise to this person. This was the replaying of everything that we've already explored. The work pressure, being depleted and tired, survival modes being activated, productivity being highly valued. The quiet belief really that rest was not allowed. Chiron doesn't create pain, it reveals it, and Lilith removes the mask and also can really exaggerate the coping mechanisms and coping patterns as well. So when we talk about this final nail in the coffin, this is it. A Pluto-ruled individual in a Pluto station, but going retrograde within about 36 hours. In a body that was compromised through overwork and overindulgence, standing on a Chiron Venus-Lilith line where wounds around worth and survival and love would have come fully into view. There was nothing left buffering the system. There was no support system really there for this person to escape to. And Avicii's death was ruled a suicide, but energetically, really, this wasn't impulsive, it was cumulative. So they would have been reacting, but from a cumulative pressure, all these things building up on their timeline. Exactly what we saw with Caroline Flack in episode 1. A system that has been surviving for too long without repair, which brings us to difficult but essential questions. What if the intervention needed wasn't only psychological? What if it was also nutritional and physiological and systemic depletion crisis? There's a lot in his human design chart that speaks to when we link up these illnesses that he suffered, the pancreatitis, especially when we link it up to his human design chart, was activated by certain transits at the time as well, which really leads me to really get people to consider all the different ways in which we need to look after ourselves. It's not just emotional. I talk about emotional a lot on this podcast because that is the part that I am really passionate about, but nutritional is really important. Physiological, how we deplete and use and abuse ourselves is really important as well, because we, within his ill health, he would have needed kidney support, how to reduce inflammation, not even inflammation, real life practices on how to reduce inflammation, work around restoring physical resilience, because this was a body that was tired, not just a mind and an emotional state that was triggered. Sometimes despair isn't really just a failure of mindset, it can be a failure of resources and the ways in which we support ourselves. So Avicii's legacy lives on through his music that helped millions feel, I was going to say feel understood, but actually helped millions to feel. But his passing asks us to widen the conversation. Mental health cannot be separated from the body. Work and money pressure cannot be separated from well-being. And survival energy cannot be ignored indefinitely. Your chart doesn't show your fate, it shows where support is essential. So thank you for listening to this latest episode of Truly Tragic Transits. In the next episode, we're going to be exploring another deeply sensitive story, that of the legendary Robin Williams, and what it means to carry joy for others whilst quietly carrying pain yourself. But until then, keep an eye on the transits, because you never know what keys they might hold.